Honorable Justice B.V. Nagaratna, Honorable Chief Justice of Karnataka, Honorable Judges of the High Court of Karnataka, conference speakers and participants, eminent guests, and the intellectually curious students here today. Good evening and welcome to the closing plenary address of the Pluralist Agreement in Constitutional Transformation Conference. This multidisciplinary conference is organized by the National Law School of India University, the Center for Law and Policy Research, the University of Oxford, York University, and the School of Oriental and Asian Studies. This conference began with an opening keynote by Professor Pratap Mehta, the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. 24 papers were presented by faculty and scholars from leading universities in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in India. The speakers at this conference include the leading scholars and academics on Indian constitution making, and we are confident that this conference will advance and support major advances in this field in the next decade. We have, for our closing plenary address, joining us today, Honorable Justice B.V. Nagaratna. And I will introduce Justice Nagaratna briefly before I invite her to deliver the closing address. Justice Nagaratna is from Bangalore and one of our own, and has a BA Honours in History from Jesus and Mary College in 1984 and an LLB degree in 1987 from the Campus Law Center, Delhi University. Justice Nagaratna started practice in 1987 and was appointed on the 18th of February 2008 as an additional judge of the Karnataka High Court, and then further as a permanent judge on 17th February 2010. She is the first woman from the Karnataka Bar to be appointed to the High Court. On 31st August 2021, Justice Nagaratna was elevated as a judge of the Supreme Court of India, where she currently serves as the chairperson of the Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare Committee and a member of the Supreme Court Gender Sensitization and Internal Complaints Committee. Often, when we request honorable judges of various courts to deliver lectures, we don't always expect that the academic themes of the conference are necessarily reflected in the judge's address. But today, we have Justice Nagaratna deliver a lecture on the theme, Home in the Nation, Indian Women's Constitutional Imaginaries. Justice Nagaratna and her office have worked with us closely on the themes, and the speakers of the conference are very confident that this will be a treat for all of us who are interested in the question of gender in the court. May I now invite Honorable Justice Nagaratna to deliver the closing keynote address.
Namaskar and a very good evening to everybody. Honorable Chief Justice of Karnataka, Sri Acharya, learned brother judges of the High Court of Karnataka, Dr. Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Vice Chancellor of NLSIU and co-investigator of PACT. Thank you for your introduction. Professor Lochna Bajpai, Professor of Politics at the School for Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and the Principal Investigator of PACT. Sri Vineet Krishna, Senior Research Associate, and hope he's here. Sir. Senior advocates and advocates, academics, researchers engaged in PACT, faculty and students of NLSIU, members of the press and digital media, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor for me to deliver the keynote address for the PACT project and the NLSIU conference. I must congratulate NLSIU Center for Law and Policy Research and their foreign collaborators on their vision of promoting cutting-edge scholarship on India's constitutional founding. I have always been a votary of rigorous and non-partisan scholarly exploration of not just our constitutional law, but our history, philosophy, politics, and sociology. I am reminded of Mahatma Gandhi's wise words, and I quote, "I do not want my house to be walled in all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the culture of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible. But I refuse to be blown off my feet by any," unquote. I hope that scholars working on this crucial project would continue to be guided by the spirit of this statement. 75 years ago, the aspiration for an enduring constitution of India was seen by some as bold and by others as unattainable. But thanks to the vision of our founders of our republic, grammar of elections and Westminster-style representative institutions have found deep roots in India. The framers of our constitution crafted a masterly document that binds every Indian who lives in the vast geographical landmass of India. The text, structure, intent, and context of the Constitution of India envisions a peaceful revolution. As a student of history, I find that the structure of the Constitution to be a natural outcome of the transformative ideals espoused by the Indian people during the freedom struggle. Granville Austin rightly said that the provisions of the Constitution are aimed at realizing the goals of the social revolution. They denote an attempt to foster social justice by establishing the conditions necessary for its achievement. After all, freedom struggle was not merely a quest for political independence, but a mission of social transformation and moral and spiritual recovery. The Constitution of India embodies a moment of profound transformation. As the state undergoes political change, legacies of injustice have a bearing on what is deemed transformative. Broadly, there were two legacies of injustice as far as India was concerned that the Constitution sought to transform. First, the Constitution transformed the legal relationship between the individual and the British state, and the individual and the princely states. It transformed the subjects of a colonial regime into a citizen of Republic of India. The Indian Constitution was transformative in a second sense. It contemplated a thorough reconstruction of not only the state but society too. In a more comprehensive transformative avatar, the Constitution recognized that the state had never been the only locus of concentrated power in Indian society. Deeply pervasive hierarchies were maintained by structures that took various forms, caste being one such form. Understood in that sense, the framing of the Constitution did not only mark the end of a struggle against political subjugation, but equally demonstrates a struggle for self-determination against multi-layered oppressive structures such as race and caste. The bold aspirations of our transformative Constitution are manifest in its grant of rights and remedies against oppressive social wrongs such as prejudice, stigma, stereotypes, and exploitation. As a starting point, Sarojini Naidu addressed the Constituent Assembly in her quest to seek and influence an inclusive Constituent Assembly that would represent the oppressed and inch towards the bold aspirations. She observed, and I quote, I hope those that call themselves the original masters of this land, the tribal people, will realize that there is no distinction of caste, creed, ancient or modern, status in this Constituent Assembly. I hope the smallest minority in this country will, whether represented politically or I do not know by what other means they may be represented, I hope they will realize that they have a zealous, vigilant and loving guardian of their interests, who who will not permit the more privileged to encourage by a hair's breadth on their birthright of equity and equal opportunity in this country, unquote. It is in the above backdrop that the framers of our constitution imagined, conceptualized, and articulated a vocabulary of rights and freedoms. But what role did women play in the crafting of an inclusive and transformative constitutional discourse? That is the question I seek to reflect upon in my address titled Home in the Nation, Indian Women's Constitutional Imagination. I have selected this title for the reason that Indian women's constitutional imagination sought the radical transformation of the private sphere through the political force of nationalism. In other words, revitalizing the private sphere and assuring the dignity of women was the cornerstone of the national agenda for social renaissance. Nationalism in India was neither the sole preserve of the men nor merely preoccupied with political liberty. Through the course of my lecture, I want to shed light on how the Indian women made sure that their aspirations for the nation domesticated the idea of equal private spaces and institutions. Over the course of my address, I would firstly highlight how the Indian women's movement cultivated a transformative yet pragmatic constitutional imagination, demonstrate how the constitutional semantics and design that we so treasure today are products of a women's movement which coalesced the struggle to transform the private sphere, that is the home, with the transcendental quest for national enfranchisement and emancipation. Therefore, I would argue that Indian women's participation in the Constituent Assembly has fundamentally impacted the Constitution's transformative approach. At this juncture, I begin by acknowledging the 15 women members who enlightened the Constituent Assembly with moral vision and we must credit for posterity. Ambu Swaminathan, Dakshayani Velayudan, G. Durgabai, also known as Durgabai Deshmukh, Hansa Mehta, Leela Roy, Purnima Banerjee, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Renuka Ray, Sarojini Naidu, Vijayalakshmi Pandit. The contributions of Begum Aizaz Rasool, Kamla Chaudhary, Sucheta Kripalani, Malati Chaudhary, and Annie Mascarenhas in laying the foundation of our constitution are poles of guidance. Indian women's movement. The legendary freedom fighter Rajkumari Amrit Kaur in 1932 in Jalandhar said, and I quote, "The women of India are no longer willing to submit to standards, whether local, political or ethical, which have been set for them by the male conscience of the community. We are passionately aware that such standards have often been allowed to imply the complete subordination or even degradation of whole classes of women. We are aware of the necessity of finding and being judged by our own standards of free human beings, voluntarily accepted. We are determined to face the facts of life, to fight the battles of our sex and take the risks," unquote. This solitary statement is a roaring reflection of the socio-political churn that crystallized into the constitutional values of gender equality and justice. As a student of history, I have always viewed gender justice as reflected in the concomitant struggles for abolition of sati, widow remarriage, and women's education, nothing short of the cornerstone of this moral mission. The legends such as Rajaram Mohan Roy, Dadabhai Naoroji, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Jyotiba Phule, and Mahatma Gandhi are well known. Activists such as Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule gallantly struggled for the educational rights of women from marginalized communities. In the course of the next few minutes, I will touch upon three themes: gender equality, socio-economic rights, and social reform, and discuss the role of women leaders' advocacy in shaping this discourse. As Professor Achyut Chetan has shown in his book, in fact, I've borrowed a lot from his book. Nice to meet you. Founding Mothers of the Indian Republic, that unlike the Western world, the Indian women's movement for legal rights was a collaborative venture with male reformers, not a militant confrontation. This is very unique to India, where women carried the men along with them for their emancipation, unlike being militant as against the men in other Western world. This spirit went beyond mere attainment of women's rights. Building on the Declaration on Fundamental Rights by the Indian National Congress at Karachi in 1931, this spirit was first presented in the report of the Subcommittee on Women's Role in Planned Economy, presented to National Planning Committee in 1940. It is in this report that the Indian women's movement demanded the right to vote without restrictions based on property, literacy, or marriage. It also advocated for equal inheritance and equal social and economic opportunities for women. For more correct reasons than one, such plural, creative, and enterprising membership of society was rightfully termed by Rajkumari Amrit Kaur as constructive citizenship. Renuka Ray, the only woman member of the Hindu Law Committee, relied on modern legal textbooks on Hindu law before the committee and supplemented the reformist stance with constructive readings of the Shastric texts and the judicial pronouncements of the colonial state. Realizing the ramifications that a bill coming out of the committee would have, she rallied progressive male leaders in support of the bill to persuade the committee to think in terms of women's rights. On the advice of her mentor, the constitutionalist B.N. Rao, Renuka Ray tactily set narrow sights at getting the committee to agreement on absolute estate for women, Section 14 of the Hindu Succession Act. Both B.N. Rao and Renuka Ray were in unison that it was a success to secure the central issue of women's right to be recognized, then their share, the latter being reserved for later. That is the 2005 amendment under the Hindu Succession Act. A strategy within the constitutional semantics that women leaders carried through the Constituent Assembly was to dispel the traditional notion of women being biologically inferior, but to locate themselves within the framework of the constitutionalism. The most articulate and comprehensive advocacy for gender equality as a fundamental right was through the Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties in the year 1946. This charter was drafted by Hansa Mehta and was accepted by the All India Women's Conference. The spirit of the articles of the charter manifested in the right to equal protection and right against non-discrimination as under Articles 14, 15.1, 15.2 and 15.4 and 23 of the Constitution. The spirit of emboldening women's rights radiates in Rajkumari Amrit Kaur's forceful words to the Minorities Subcommittee of the Constituent Assembly, terming women as technically the largest minority in India, as custom, usage and even law militated against women. I think that is the necessity and essentiality of this perspective that explains the commitment to ensuring equality that is explicit on a reading of Articles 15.1 and Article 15.3, read with Articles 39A, D, E and 42. Article 15.3, read with Articles 39A, D, E and 42, reflects a strong commitment towards special measures to ensure equality and break the shackles of gender-based discrimination and disadvantage within both the public and private spheres. Jurisprudentially, this constructive spirit of Indian women's constitutional imagination of equality between man and woman shaped our progressive equality doctrine. The decision of the Supreme Court in C.V. Muttamma vs. Union of India is highly instructive in this regard. The great Justice Krishnaiyer rendered a judgment finding such disabilities based on marriage to be a facet of stark bias against women, and he observed, quote, if the family and domestic commitments of a woman member of the service is likely to come in the way of efficient discharge of duties, a similar situation may well arise in the case of a male member, unquote. On more than one occasion, the Supreme Court has been asked to scrutinize protectionist stereotypes or restrictions that disproportionately impact women, notably Anuj Garg versus Hotel Association of India, and recently Babita Punya and Lieutenant Colonel Nitisha are stark examples of such cases. As members of important subcommittees of the Constituent Assembly, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur and Srimati Hansa Mehta made use of written notes of dissent and submissions to convey the perspective of the women's movement. While their numerical inferiority would have diluted the impact of any amendment made in the Constituent Assembly, their effective rationalization and active pursuit within the committees ensured that the perspective was not lost in a sea of male voices. It has been a long desired objective of the Indian women's movement to secure the true spirit of equality and its pragmatic ramifications. As Professor Achyut Chetan notes, and I quote, thus, the demands for special waiting rooms, compartments, and safety measures for women in the railways by Dakshayani Velayutham, Aizaz Rasool, and Annie Masquerade must be read as activation of the constitutional articles, even as they were being formulated. This is on account of their experience. They all traveled all the way from South Kerala and other places to the north to the Constituent Assembly. Dakshayani took special interest in scholarship for Dalit girls and protective clauses for Dalit female factory workers. Renuka Ray proposed special attention to the mental health of refugee women. Durgabai demanded vocational training for refugee women who are victims of partition violence, a special budget for women's education, raised questions about women's recruitment into the IAS and the IPS, sought attention to the education of female students abroad, and advocated women's license to drive hackney carriages. Several of these women also demanded the enhancement of women's presence in the police force and provision for their necessary training. Aizaz Rasool demanded special recruitment of women to defense services, objected to the Armed Forces Special Powers Bill, demanded registration of women in employment exchanges, and emphasized the recruitment of women in diplomatic services. Ammu Swaminathan, another member, sought special assistance for female medical personnel in securing employment. Annie Masquerade demanded raising the salary of and better equipping nurses and female medical workers. These and several other interventions made in the Constituent Assembly in its legislative functions contributed to the gendering of the entire framing discourse. These are evidence of the way in which women members compelled the framing body to engage with the contingencies and vulnerabilities of women, unquote. Equality and social justice. At this point, I deem it important to shed light on women's role in the Constituent Assembly deliberations on another aspect of equality. In her indomitable commitment against untouchability, Dakshayani Velayutham reminded the Constituent Assembly of the state's responsibility to actively manifest the Constitution's transformative intent to ensure equality before law and equal protection for all. The preamble of the Constitution pledges to secure justice, social, economic, and political to all citizens. When read together with Articles 38, 39, and 46, accentuate the quest for a just social order. Their noble aspiration is to enrich the representative bodies and public services with the voice and participation of the marginalized. For instance, by granting political reservations to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the Constitution ensures that members of socially marginalized groups are not excluded from the political executive and governance. In that sense, the Constitution set a benchmark for inclusive governance and social justice. The provisions for reservation, or what may be called affirmative action or compensatory discrimination, are central to the constitutional goal of social justice. Justice Chinnaparetty's judgment in the case of Vasant Kumar captured the essence of social justice when he stated that the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, and other socially and educationally backward classes, compendiously described as the weaker sections of the society, have long journeys to make in society. They need aid, they need facility, they need launching, they need propulsion. Their needs are their demands. The demands are matters of right and not of philanthropy. They ask for parity and not for charity. They claim their constitutional right to equality of status and of opportunity and economic and social justice. Several bridges have to be erected so that they may cross the Rubicon. Professional education and employment under the state are thought to be two such bridges. In the same case, Venkatramaya Justice observed on economic backwardness thus, and I quote, "There are in all castes and communities poor people who, if they are given adequate opportunity and training, may be able to compete successfully with persons belonging to richer classes. The government may provide for them liberal grants of scholarships, free ships, free studentships, free boarding and lodging facilities, free uniforms, free midday meals, etc., to make the life of poor students comfortable. It all comes from one's experience. The government may also provide extra tutorial facilities, stationery and books free of cost, and library facilities. These and other steps should be taken in the lower classes so that by the time the student appears for the qualifying examination, he may be able to attain a high degree of proficiency in his studies. Unquote. Having discussed the role of our founding mothers in ideation and formation of our equality code, I now expound upon social reform and empowerment. Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties had radical proposals for education and health. It emphasized that the lack of accessibility and poor quality of education hindered the country's growth. Striking a chord for equality in all aspects of education, the Charter demanded that there shall be no basic difference between the education of man and woman, as their duties as citizens are the same. At the same time, it acknowledged the social evils that prevented women's education and provided that government should take immediate steps to eradicate the evils of child marriage, child labor, parda, and untouchability which come in the way of education and especially of girls' education. Recognizing the financial handicaps that poor parents face, it provided for scholarship and support services for women. Similarly, on the question of health, the Charter was remarkable in its vision. It stated that the health of every man, woman, and child is the nation's greatest asset. In a great instance of foresight, Article 8 of the Charter provided that the woman who works in the home shall have a right to a part of her husband's income to be used by her. That is what I have observed in Muhammad Abdul Samad vs. State of Telangana recently under Section 125 of the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973. It is for this reason that I believe that the freedom movement and our founders imagined a new Indian woman with a complete individuality and self-sufficiency. A bare glance at the preamble as well as the chapters of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy shows that our constitution sought to break the shackles of gender-based discrimination and transform into a just social order. With the passage of time, the Supreme Court of India has considered itself responsible to ensuring that the transformation of social order and emboldening of socio-economic rights envisioned by our constitution makers is not hindered by state inaction and callousness. This role is as much the action of an activist court as it is the duty. Durgabai Deshmukh, speaking in the Constituent Assembly on abolition of Privy Council Jurisdiction Bill, observed her vision for the Supreme Court as a guardian of the Constitution in the following words, quote, "This bill, when it becomes an act, will usher in the era of judicial autonomy in India. The important changes made therein are all corollary to the political and constitutional independence of this country. When the Constitution is passed, our federal court will be designated as the Supreme Court. It will be the highest court of appeal for all high courts and also the judicial authority for the interpretation of the Constitution. We wish and we hope that the Supreme Court, which is going to be the guardian of the Constitution and of the fundamental rights guaranteed therein, will do its function very well, and every citizen in India will have the occasion to say that it has protected his rights as a true guardian of this Constitution." Unquote. It is for us, the present and future generation of Supreme Court judges, to keep up to this hope and trust. A discussion on social reform and empowerment within our transformative Constitution must acknowledge the seminal role exemplified by Durgabai Deshmukh in ensuring that Article 25(2)(b) of the Constitution is of the widest and expansive breadth. Article 19(2)(b) as Article 25(2)(b) appeared in the draft Constitution, enabled the state to make any law for social welfare and reform or for throwing open Hindu religious institutions of a public character to any class or section of Hindus. Intending to enlarge the scope of this clause, Durgabai Deshmukh moved an amendment substituting the words all classes and sections instead of any class or section. In her view, although the Assembly had not been able to bring in a comprehensive reform, a distinction of any kind between classes of Hindus in accessing Hindu religious institutions was impermissible and irreconcilable with the Constitution. I find that Durgabai's temper towards the amendment reflected the strategic decision making in securing reform and transformation that was quintessential of the founding mothers. Most consciously, the amendment ensured that social realities were transformed wherever distinctions between classes and sections of Hindus had continued, even in pathshalas, educational institutions, and other institutions managed by the Hindu religious institutions. Fundamental rights and directive principles. The sweeping contributions of women members of the Constituent Assembly, particularly in leading the subcommittee on fundamental rights of the Constituent Assembly, to not restrict directive principles of state policy as intended for the general guidance, but to make them fundamental in the governance of the country, and the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws is noteworthy. As remarked by Justice Bhagwati in Minerva Mills versus Union of India, this conscious change by constitution makers brought about a total transformation of Article 37 and fundamentally altered its significance and efficacy. As Professor Achyut Chetan notes, evidence makes it determinate that Rajkumari Amrit Kaur and Hansa Mehta steered for good the semantics of this constitutional provision. Despite their non-justiciable nature, the constitutional structure and need for harmony between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy has been instructive for the Supreme Court to initiate socio-economic reform. Ammu Swaminathan elucidated that within our constitutional design, social transformation would be effectuated through twin support of Part 3 and Part 4. She observed as follows, quote, I feel that the Constitution actually rests on two pillars, fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy. The fundamental rights of the people of India are guaranteed in such matters as freedom of speech, association, and worship, unquote. The preamble of our transformative Constitution pledges to secure justice, social, economic, and political to all citizens, and a harmonious interpretation of Part 3 and Part 4 has aided the Supreme Court in finding a broad understanding of state duties. Indian women's constitutional imagination devoted its political labors to the cause of social transformation. Social justice in its truest sense calls for the transformative effort to undo the impact of pervasive social hierarchies and past injustice. It also demands the creation of conditions of justice. The private sphere, the family, was one such institution which perpetuated social injustice. As for the private sphere, I must note that the most secure tool for social reform and against economic exploitation of women is the financial independence of women. A woman's ambition to participate, constructively contribute, and grow in the formal workforce is often hindered due to the lack of sharing of household duties and responsibilities such as rearing children or carrying out domestic chores. For a transformative change in society and securing true constructive citizenship, the protection of law must ensure that women don't have to strike a bargain between motherhood and employment. Recently, the Supreme Court decided in Deepika Singh that a woman's statutory right to avail maternity leave could not be denied as she had availed childcare leave earlier for her non-biological kids from the first marriage of her spouse. That even in 2022, the Supreme Court was compelled to categorically explain the grant of maternity leave is intended to encourage women to join and continue in the workforce. Recently, finding that Section 125 CRPC is a beneficial provision in addition to personal law, the Supreme Court in Mohammed Abdul Samad held that a divorced Muslim woman is not precluded by operation of the 1986 Act from claiming maintenance under Section 125 of the CRPC. What drove the court was that financial empowerment places an Indian woman in a more secure position in the society, irrespective of the faith that a woman belongs to. The stability that follows from financial empowerment ensures that the succeeding generation imbibes moral and ethical values of life that go a long way in building a strong Indian society. Political empowerment. In my view, a transformative outlook on inclusive governance necessarily includes women in active decision making. Manifesting the spirit of constructive citizenship, the state of Karnataka requires that not less than 50% of the representatives in local bodies be women. In a 2011 judgment authored by me in the Karnataka High Court, T. Venkatesh led to the change of the discriminatory Rule 13 of the Karnataka Municipalities President and Vice President election rules that forbade two women from holding the office of President and Vice President respectively in local bodies simultaneously. I found that such a bar was not applicable when it came to reservation in the male category. It was reasoned that when a separate reservation for women had to be compulsorily complied with in furtherance of Article 15(3), there could not be a further discrimination in that regard. There was another proviso which stated that one woman president or vice president, they say Adhyaksha and Upadhyaksha, respectively, could not be followed by another woman president or vice president. I found that strange. If a male president and vice president could follow one another, why can't one woman follow another? Therefore, I struck down the same on the basis of not just Article 15(3), but also on the basis of Article 15(1). The Constitution, next, constitutional functionaries' role of governor. The constitutional morality and constitutional semantics developed by our founding mothers must not be pigeonholed by a discourse to look at them only as members of the women's movement. Our academic and legal discourse must credit our founding mothers as primarily and wholly constitutionalists with enviable foresight. On the subject of neutrality of governors, Durgabai Deshmukh, in her seasoned political and legal wisdom, remarked, quote, "Certain functions are expected to be discharged by the governor. We want to introduce the governor in our constitution because we thought that an element of harmony would be there and that institution would bring about some sort of understanding and harmony between the conflicting groups of people if really the governor is conscious of his duties and he functions well. It is only for this purpose this is proposed. The governing idea is to place the governor above party politics, above factions, and not to subject him to the party affairs," unquote. But in today's times, unfortunately, some of the governors in India are playing a role where they ought not to and are inactive where they ought to be. Cases against the governors in Supreme Court is a sad story on the constitutional position of the governor in India. Sovereignty of the Indian people. An instance of acute farsightedness and exposition of society was displayed by Purnima Mukherjee in her assertion, along with her amendment, that the preamble of our constitution must reflect that ultimate sovereignty lies with the people. She argued that, quote, "Sir, I feel that the constitution which we have drawn up has invested the president and parliament with wide powers. At this moment, I do not think we should be content with considering the masses of our people as the sovereign authority from whom all power is derived and in whom all sovereign authority rests, by merely believing that because they go to the polls once in 5 years, their sovereignty is secured. Therefore, I feel that in the preamble, mention of that sovereignty should be made." However, the preamble does not say, though it says sovereign republic, the word that people are sovereign is not mentioned, but it is widely understood. I come to the conclusion. In essence, the Indian women fortified our founding charter in a way that has made our constitutional democracy more enduring. As we look forward towards deepening Indian constitutionalism, we should emphasize on federalism, fraternity, fundamental rights, and principled governance. Federalism. It needs to be borne in mind that Union and the states have the mandate to attend to subjects of national and regional import respectively. The subjects under the state's jurisdiction are not insignificant, nor should states be presumed incapable or subordinate. The spirit of constitutional statesmanship and not partisan brinkmanship should be the mantra at the central level. At the core of their respective jurisdiction is Janakalyana, public welfare, or what can also be called public interest. Fraternity. Fraternity even today remains the least understood, least discussed, and perhaps the least practiced of the four ideals spelled out in the preamble of India's constitution, the other three being justice, equality, and liberty. The constitution views fraternity significantly as a source of affirming the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. The former is accomplished by recognizing the moral equality of individuals, upheld through mutual respect despite all our differences of religious belief, caste, language, culture, ethnicity, class, and gender. The idea of the unity of the nation being derived from fraternity is even more significant today than ever before. Fraternity may perhaps even be the key for the deepening of our democracy. It is in this context I state that the quest towards achieving the ideal of fraternity must begin with an acknowledgement by every citizen of his or her fundamental duties, which are enumerated under Article 51A of the Constitution. This should begin at home and transcend to the nation. Present-day discourse reflects much to be desired in securing the constructive citizenship and equality that our founding mothers rallied for, and which alone can be the basis of mutual respect and understanding, and without which real cooperation is not possible between man and woman. The fundamental duties are to be understood as an unexceptionable charter of constitutional ideals which citizens could usefully absorb and practice so as to attain an ideal citizenship for creating and building a stronger nation having an important position in the Comity of Nations. Fundamental rights. State institutions and civil society should treasure fundamental rights. A plethora of rights violation can be prevented by strictly following 1. The procedure established by law, 2. Respecting the spirit of rule of law, and 3. Consultative and deliberative decision making. The judicial role in this respect remains critical. As we sculpt the future of a dynamic and inclusive judiciary, we must be informed by ethics of empathy for the ordinary litigant. Embracing equity in this context would mean re-examining prevailing assumptions around legal service and justice delivery. Being a service that is entirely independent and only answerable to the authority of law, a judicial officer at whatever level he or she may be must bear in mind that he is the service of we the people of India. After all, to borrow the fallacious expression from Justice Vivian Bose, it has been a zealous endeavour of the Indian judiciary that the constitution should work for the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. The judges of the highest adjudicatory body in the world's largest democracy consider it their duty to redeem their constitutional oath and do justice no less to the pavement dweller than to the guest of the five-star hotel. See Ranveer Singh versus Union of India. These are the words of Justice Chinnapareddy. As a member of the Indian judiciary, I am assured that in the decades to come, the courts in India as a composite institution will serve we the people and steer the chariot of justice towards our constitutional destiny. Principled governance. Last but not the least, from a constitutional society, we should evolve into a constitutional polity. That means our political life should emphasize the haloed goals enshrined in the preamble of the Constitution. Our public policies cannot be unheard from the principle of economic democracy. There is no gainsaying that our transformative Constitution was a charter of social and economic democracy. The directive principles should be the talisman for our politics and governance. If we achieve the goal of principled governance, social justice would become a reality. I thus end on a note of introspection. Indian constitutional democracy was not destined to greatness. It has earned it. In this arduous struggle to earn our stature as a mature democracy, our founding fathers and mothers have made countless sacrifices. Each successive generation has built this great country. As a part of this wide-scale landscape of diversities, we should introspect as to whether the founding ideals have been secured. Such an introspection would also provide a template for conversations about building a better tomorrow. We as a nation have come a long way, but we have a longer way to go before truly meeting all the ideals of the founders in the sense that they were envisaged. Fortunately, there is a constitution which touches, moves, and inspires our collective lives like a North Star. It is a permanent reminder that a more democratic, a more equal, a more just, and a more tolerant nation continues to remain an ideal even in contemporary times. To conclude, I may again advert to Hansa Mehta's profound thoughts during the closing discussion of the Constituent Assembly on 22nd November 1949. Quote, "The goodness or badness of a constitution depends on how it is going to work. If it works in the interest of the people, it will be a good constitution. If it works otherwise, it will be a bad constitution. It is for the future electors to elect the right kind of persons who will work the constitution in the interest of the people. The responsibility therefore lies with the people. The valuable endeavors and efforts of our founding mothers must be carried forward by every succeeding generation of not only women but by all concerned. They did not limit themselves to only gender rights or women's position in Indian society. The responsibility lies with us and with the future generation." On that optimistic note, I conclude my lecture. I once again express my gratitude to NLSIU Center for Law and Policy Research and their foreign collaborators for giving me this opportunity to share a few of my thoughts. I thank you all for your kind attention. Namaskar.
It is my great pleasure and privilege to thank Honorable Justice P.V. Nagaratna, Judge of the Supreme Court of India, Honorable Chief Justice N.V. Anjaria of the High Court of Karnataka, Honorable Justice Kamleshwar Rao, Honorable Justice Shri Shananda, Honorable Justice Adiga, Honorable Justice Basavaraj, Honorable Justice Venkatesh Nair for having graced our closing ceremony. When we thought of a lecture, public lecture for this occasion, I know I speak for Professor Krishnaswamy and all members of the PAC team that we could not have chosen a better subject and speaker than the Honorable Justice P.V. Nagaratna. Her lecture today has given us much to think about and reflect upon, and I look forward to having the first female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court history. PACT commemorates 75 years of India's Constitution next year. We wish you all the very best ahead. Thank you.